This is my Commodore 64 power supply. It's one I've made myself using an AC plug pack and a 5 volt 3 amp DC plug pack and a cable from an old power supply, and indeed the plastic logo from an old power supply. The Commodore 64 power supply produces 9 volts AC and 5 volts DC. The way that the power supply produces 5 volts DC puts the components involved under exceptional stress, and the power supplies are not particularly reliable, have been known to fail catastrophically, including with flames, and can also, if the 5 volt side fails in a particular way, deliver a higher unregulated voltage to the computer and destroy it. I don't plug original unmodified Commodore 64 power supplies into a Commodore 64, not ever. They are, in my view, not to be trusted. There are many options. One is to replace the 5 volt side of the power supply if it's one that can be worked on. This one that I started with here was potted and in epoxy and was unserviceable. Can be fixed by replacing the 5 volt side with a modern power supply, and that's a great solution, but it's one that involves mains voltages and is therefore something which is at very least technically for qualified personnel only, and fiddling with mains voltages is not something that it is something I try and avoid. This setup here is really in many ways straightforward. 5 volts 3 amps is regulated, it's always 5 volts. The Commodore 64 power supply put out a little more than that to deal with resistance in this cable, but I've not had any trouble running it at straight 5 volts. And this is a 1 amp 9 volt AC supply. I have come across examples of aftermarket supplies which I think, with the idea they'll make it better, use a AC supply that's rated for substantially more power than this, and that's no good. The output of this is unregulated, and so if this were a 10 amp 9 volt supply and one were to draw only a half an amp from it, the 9 volts AC would be much higher than 9 volts AC, and that's no good. And that's something that has to be properly checked. There are even better solutions. I have a Commodore 64 reloaded board, and it generates the 9 volts AC on the board, and so with some sort of inverter setup, and so the 9 volts AC that it uses is bang on. But something to keep in mind, and some of the aftermarket supplies, as I say, have a 9 volts AC output which is very much on the high side. So 2 plug packs. If I'm using them, I usually plug these into a double adapter so that they come on and off together, because there's no switch on here. I'll just remove the screws from here. There we go. I accidentally pulled it off beforehand. I goofed my own stupid joke. I could have just run this straight through, right? But I haven't done. I've used one of these chocolate blocks. I find them to be really excellent for managing cables and stuff. These days I put ferrules on these wires so that they don't get cut by the screws, and it adds some extra insulation. Hang on, I'll show them to you. I've got a box of them over here somewhere. Yeah, these fellows, I'll show you a big one because on the camera, they fit over the wire. They provide some insulation, and there's a special crimping tool that comes in and crimps that from 4, or I think some of them even do from 6 sides. I do believe that you're not supposed to do those screws up onto solder because it sort of creeps and comes loose over time, but those ferrules are great. They stop little bits of copper, and they provide some extra insulation. The other thing you'll see in here are 2 fuses, and fuses are always a good plan. And here we have 2 capacitors, a 100 nanofarad or 0.1 of a microfarad ceramic, which will help deal with any high frequency noise left from the 5 volts DC, and an electrolytic capacitor of a slightly higher value, again to help deal with any noise from the 5 volt supply. The other nice thing about that is that the 16 volt electrolytic, if it's connected up to power backwards, it'll be a short circuit, which could either cause the power supply to trip or blow this fuse, but should mean that the computer itself never sees reverse voltage. It's not something I've experimented with. I wouldn't want to stress the power supply in that way or whatever. The value of this capacitor can't just be huge. It would create a massive load on this every time it started. Hopefully, if you're trying to do this and you want to use a capacitor, you can make your own judgment about it, or find something in the plug packs data sheet. Without making a recommendation on what you should do, remember this channel's about what I did. The one I've used here is a 470 microfarad 16 volt capacitor, and you know, I don't recall there being any sparking when I turned it on, so that's hot now. Yeah, it's fine. So this is a way to get a Commodore 64 power supply up and running by buying a high quality plug pack from a reputable supplier here in Australia. I'm confident that it is one that's safe to use. It at 3 amps has ample power compared to the original supply, and it powers my Commodore 64 really well. The only thing I really wish for from a Commodore 64 power supply that I've never seen would be to have the 5 volt wires go to the computer and then a second pair of wires go to the computer as well, just for measuring the voltage actually at the computer. And then you can adjust, the power supply can automatically adjust to hold the voltage in the computer at 5 volts, even as the load changes. It's sort of a Kelvin contact type setup. And there are power supplies that do that. They're, I suppose, relatively advanced. But what we're left with doing is either using what we've got, or if the power supply is adjustable, then turning up the wick a little bit, perhaps when the computer is as unloaded as it can be. And as I say, as I think I said, Commodore actually ran the output on a lot of their power supplies at above 5 volts to deal with resistance in this cable and elsewhere. So our solution for powering a Commodore 64, I would choose this over an original power supply every day, because as I say, the original power supplies are entirely untrustworthy in my book. And as I also say, the value of this capacitor, I mean, there will be some amount of capacitance on here that will cause this thing to fail, perhaps catastrophically. I don't know what it is, and I don't make recommendations about it. If I was more concerned, I'd leave it out, but I do really like the reverse voltage protection it provides. And honestly, looking at it now, having built this some years ago, that capacitor is perhaps, that low ESR electrolytic is perhaps on the high side. I might put in a lower value.